there was two incidents that happened in Perth over Christmas last year and March this year, where a father first had taken his life, but also the life of his kids. And then later on, a mother did the same. And for me, it was like, no, like, this has got to stop. You know, there's no way that this is a solution. And the more that we keep going down the path that we have been, it's gonna end up in more disaster. So for me, it's like, if I can help any dad change the way that they deal with things and create, you know, the vision that they want for themselves and also their kids, then that's a win.
That's Pat Domenico. He was once one of a growing number of single fathers in Australia. Pat's parents were separated when he was growing up, and he was dead set on avoiding a repeat with his relationship, but it didn't work out that way. He's been put through the ringer in the family court system and has had a steep learning curve. Now Pat's a husband and father of 3, helping single dads navigate co-parenting and to be the best they can be. Welcome to Young Blood, an award-winning podcast on a mission to make the mental health of young men a top priority. My name's Callum McPherson, I'm a journalist, and this is our platform to open up and share stories of what we've been through, because we're not alone. Let's do it. Before we kick this off, I just want to say thanks so much to everyone who's taken 15 to 90 seconds out of their day to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. It boosts us up the ranks massively and makes a huge difference to how many people we can reach with these potentially life-saving stories. So thank you. And for those who haven't got around to it, please, if Young Blood has delivered you some value, let us know on there. Cheers, legends. Trigger warning, if you find anything spoken about in today's episode distressing, please contact Lifeline on 13 11 14. So Pat, you grew up in a broken home. How did that affect you as a kid?
At the time, I wasn't aware of how much it actually impacted me, but it probably affected me more as I got into my teens and young adult life. I was the oldest of 4 boys. I didn't really realise the impact until later on.
And later on, like, what was that impact when you reflected, or how did you notice it?
It was probably the behaviours that I'd formed. I struggled to connect with people, let people get too close, even with communicating. It was something that it was very hard for me to be genuine and real, I guess you could say. I was always trying to please people to make sure that everything was fine. The house was pretty volatile. My parents had me when they were quite young. Mum was nearly 18 when she had me, and Dad was 20. So they all, kids themselves.
Yeah.
And then having to raise their own child and not having much life experience, it definitely caused a lot of issues.
And of course, when you're a little kid and your parents are protecting you and taking care of you, you have no idea what their own personal situation is. But then as you grow up yourself, especially parents who are that young, having that many kids, you realise just how much pressure they would have been under, how difficult that was, and the fact that your parents are just people too, doing it for the first time, and we can't really have any appreciation of that as kids until we do it ourselves later on in life. Did you feel like that resulted in you being pretty on edge, or how do you think it might have impacted your personality?
Yeah, it definitely caused me to be on edge, and I was very, I was always having to, I felt like I was in the need of either, looking after the younger siblings, being in the situation that my parents were in. Even so, my second brother, he had an accident when he was only 3, a medical procedure that left him with brain damage. So he was left with cerebral palsy. So that added more complications, and you don't really understand like you're saying, what your parents go through until you become a parent yourself. I only became a parent at 30, and I couldn't imagine being a parent at 17 or 20.
Yeah.
Even just how much you grow as an individual from 25 to 30 is huge, let alone from 17, 18 to 30.
Yeah. I'm almost 29 now. And I'd hate to think what kind of parent I would have made in my late teenage years or my early 20s, and still certainly something that I'm not ready for just yet, I don't feel. But then you probably don't ever feel like you 100% are, I guess, as well.
No.
So how do you think that made you view relationships, seeing your parents separate and the impact that that had, how did that factor into how you wanted your own relationships to go, and perhaps the pressures that you put on yourself, or just the way that you viewed relationships, intimate relationships in general, as you grew into a man?
I always wanted to have that connection. So, from a very young age, I can remember being pretty much in some form of relationship from, young teens, and always relying on someone else for me to feel, enough, or that I was very, as I say, codependent. But then it gets to a point where once it got too much, we're getting too close, I'd do something to, sabotage the relationship. And that's the way I guess I subconsciously was protecting myself, because I didn't want the same thing to happen to me as it happened to my parents. I was engaged at 26, due to be married, and 4 months before we called it quits, or I called it quits, just putting other priorities first. And I didn't realize at the time, but it was a way for me to protect myself, because it's like, no, this is like, it can't get more serious than this.
Yeah.
So once I make this commitment, that's it. So it definitely didn't help me towards being able to be vulnerable and open and trust someone else that, someone else could possibly do the right thing by me.
So you're a bit of a commitment phobe because you put so much weight on the gravity of that situation and what that would mean and what it would mean for kids, and having experienced it yourself, perhaps more so than someone who hadn't had that upbringing.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I still had, there was still an element of control for me, that I'm not giving someone that full commitment as such. And, because I never wanted my kids to go through the same thing that I went through. My parents split up the first time when I was 6, and the final time when I was 13, and pretty much Dad was absent from there till I was about 23 when I had seen him next. And so for me, it was like, there's no way I'm going to let this happen to my kids, but not realizing that I was pretty much creating the chaos, or the end, to make sure that, I wasn't fully committed.
So when did you become a dad for the first time, and how did that come about in a way that you couldn't control?
Things happen, definitely for reasons. And one was, my first son was, his mother and I weren't actually together when we found out that she was pregnant. So we'd already been broken up for about a month or so. And then I found out that she was pregnant. And for me, I was like, oh, okay. I know this relationship's it's definitely not good for either of us.
Yeah.
But I want to do the best that I can for my son. So I was 30, just shy of 31 when my son was born. So I guess you could say I was put in a situation where I had to step up, and I wasn't going to allow for my son to have a father who was absent. So I was going to do everything I could with the situation that we had.
How'd you go during that pregnancy? What was that like between you and the mother of your child, and how are you able to try to mentally rationalize that situation, knowing that it's certainly far from ideal, and having the fears that you'd always had? How were you able to put that in perspective during the pregnancy?
Yeah, so initially it was a little bit challenging. For me, it was like, well, I don't think that we should have this child, because we're definitely not going to be together. She wanted to continue on, and so I end up saying, well, if this is what we're going to do, we're going to try and make the best of the situation. So we moved in together initially, and I thought, that would help. The agreement was that I'd stay until everything was settled, and then I'd move on. And for me, I thought, well, this is me at least not walking away from the situation and trying to make the most of it. And then once I'd actually left the place we were staying at, it was only three and a half months later where I had my first experience of a challenging co-parenting relationship, where I was told that if I wanted to see my son again, I'd have to go through the courts. So that started the 4.5-year journey of the family courts.
So when you actually brought a child into this world and that happened, how do you describe that moment and that feeling that you got? Although everything was far from perfect, can you give us an understanding of what that's actually like when that happens and how your life changes?
It's hard to put in words, but I'll do the best I can to describe it. It's a moment where there's something else bigger than you. Pretty much for me, it was like, wow, this is another human being that I've co-created that is, my responsibility to give, the best upbringing possible. The love and the connection is there from, the first second, especially when I held my son and, he made his first noises and so forth. It's, it's definitely an experience that, one of the greatest experiences I've ever had. I've been fortunate enough to have that 3 times now. It's always special every time.
So what was your attitude towards being a dad initially and after the mother of your child had given birth and you guys were then going to try to make it work for a time? Like, what was your attitude towards being a dad and how did you see your role within that?
So for me, I've always been of the mindset that as long as I put a roof over us, make sure that we've got food on the table, pay for all the bills, I've done my job. And I try to help out, here and there. But for me, I've always been big on my work pretty much since I was about maybe 15. I can't remember not working a Saturday. So for me, 6 days a week was just a normal thing. And that didn't change because my mindset was still, I needed to get to a certain level before I felt comfortable that I could provide the life that my son needed. So if anything, it put me more into overdrive with work because I felt like, well, this was unexpected. I'm not where I want to be. I don't want to not be able to give him the life that he deserves or that I wanted to give him. So that was, for me, was, okay, I've done everything that I need to do. So now I need to focus on this and make sure, I stick to my goals and get to where I need to be so that I could, provide the life that I wanted for my kids.
What were you doing for work?
So construction and property. So at the time, I just started working with a mate of mine who was a residential builder and developer. And I just parted ways from a previous business that I've been running for 7 years. And for me, it was a new opportunity and a pathway I wanted to go. And I felt like I needed to prove myself. So I had to even put in more effort. And coming from having my own business prior, having the mindset that I needed to do everything as if it was my own. So I was, 12, 14-hour days was just like the standard. I'd leave in the morning before I'd wake up. I'd come home. It'd be pretty late at night. Wouldn't have dinner most nights. And that was me pretty much 6 days a week.
And was that a form of escape for you? Do you see it that way? Like, obviously you were doing something completely necessary and you were able to find a role in that and a level of control in that, I imagine, but you weren't there a lot of the time because you were out providing in other ways. And did you view it that way? Like it was a breath of fresh air when you weren't in the home, which wasn't the kind of home that you were really aiming for?
Yeah, I didn't realize that at the time, but looking back now, I realize that part of it was me not knowing how to be a dad. My dad wasn't there for most of my life. I didn't have that connection with him and I didn't want to fail. So part of it was if I'm doing what I need to do over here, then it doesn't put me in a situation where, I stuff up as a dad. Like,
so you were focusing on what you knew, on the stuff that you knew how to control and you knew you could get up and go to work and work hard and justify that. And you didn't have much of an idea about the other stuff around being a dad. So the mentality was like, well, if I sort of leave that to the mother and don't address it, then should be sweet.
Everything will be fine. I only learned later that that's not quite how things go.
So what did you miss out on because of that, or what issues did that cause?
I would have missed out, on certain moments, from that while I was still in the household because of the impact and the strain that it caused on the relationship. Then that caused for me to miss out on a lot afterwards. especially the times where, during the 4.5 years with family courts where there was up to times of 9 months where I wouldn't see my son. My son's mother felt like that, it wasn't in the best interest of my son.
How did that relationship between you and her devolve as you got further and further into being parents and having to try to co-parent and work around each other? How did that progress over time?
Pretty much from the time that I left, and I had to start going through, lawyers and mediation and all that. It only got worse because we had no form of communication. For me, the first thing when I heard what my son's mother had said was, well, I take this quite seriously. So Monday morning, first thing, I'm at the lawyers.
Yep.
And for her, it was an attack.
And this was from when your son was 3 months old?
He was 10 months old at the time. And yeah, because of my response to her suggestion or comments, she saw that as an attack. And then we just end up in a shit fight and, with more stress and pain than it's necessary.
And that was every week that you were dealing with lawyers or responding to comments or hearing comments, and then and having to have that linger on your mind?
Especially in the later years, probably in the last couple of years, I'd have to take notes. I was due to have a Skype call with my son, and my son's mother would say, he's not available, or he'd be in the car 30 seconds before he goes to kinder. And for me, it was like a constant strain and on my brain, and having to record things, make sure that I'm there for the calls, even though I knew that most of the time, no one would answer. But doing that on a day-to-day basis, then your lawyer's calling you. Like, he was calling me at times at 9:30 at night on Sundays because for preparation for court, and I'm like, I need a break. Like, this is
because you're still working most of the time as well, and trying to have a life too. But I imagine it must just be such a burden, such a weight on you. It's so hard to concentrate on pretty much anything else a lot of the time as well.
And that, caused a lot of, health issues, especially, mental issues for me at the start of the journey. It wasn't something I expected. And, I felt like a complete failure. How did I end up in this situation where I brought a child into this world and now I don't have their father that's present? So, pretty much I was on antidepressants for a good four years, and a good 2.5 years of that, I pretty much was double dosing just to get by.
Did you have any other coping strategies? Were there anything else that manifested as a result of you trying to just get by?
The only thing that would help other than that was I had therapy sessions pretty much every week, as well as if I was able to, to exercise. At the time, I had a couple of fights in between during those 4 years. So I was competing in MMA, and that was one of the things that really helped me get through the days that I was really struggling, because I'd already worked out earlier in that morning, and it was some endorphins that I was able to release. And
was it also about having something to focus on and a community as well? So somewhere you could go to the gym, and you could talk to people, and you could, cause I do martial arts myself, when you're doing that, you can't think about anything else because you're going to pay the price if you do.
Yeah, it gave you that element of like a short break from the world where you didn't have to worry about anything else other than that. And that was pretty much my only real relief that I had during that time.
So what were you really struggling with when you think back to that, and times where you were alone and you were tossing stuff up in your head? Or how do you define what was most difficult for you about the situation mentally?
Being stuck and worrying about things that essentially I had no control of. I had no control of whether my son was going to be available at the specific time. I had no control of what the outcome was going to be with, the courts, how much time I was going to have with my son. And then, with that, poor habits of, not looking after my health, eating. I'd have periods where I fluctuate between 105 to 137 kilos within months. I get to extreme pain, then I'll be like, I need to do something about it.
So
drop the weight.
comfort eating was part of how you sort of dealt with stuff as well. Were you conscious of that? Like you would just eat your feelings, it sounds like?
Yeah, well, I did that as a kid as well. At the age of 10, I'd already weighed 80 kilos. I was only like 5'6",
It's a big 10-year-old, yeah.
Yeah, so I was still doing the same stuff in my adult life, but I didn't really realize that was the pattern. For me, it was just like, it's just food. It just made me feel good, or what I use for fuel to get by.
Did you have any support?
I did. But I think with part of my ways growing up, like I never wanted to, even though I wanted connection, I didn't want support. I didn't want help because it was like, I'm the one that gives the support. I'm the one that is meant to be okay. So for me, it was like, I need to deal with it. I'll work it out.
Typical man attitude.
Yeah, it definitely didn't serve me. Had to learn the hard way, but yeah, that was my thing. I'm getting therapy, so for me, I thought, well, I'm doing something more than maybe most guys would.
Did that help?
It did. It did, but I was like this onion that had a lot of layers. It took a lot of work to get to really the core essence of what the issues were for me and where the patterns all started from.
Were you able to develop a relationship with your son? How did that period of time, which was so tumultuous, impact your relationship with him now? Do you still feel the effects of that?
I did. It's funny because last year, September, we moved to Perth, and in the best interest of the family, all that stuff that was going on with Melbourne, with restrictions and with COVID and all that.
You and your new partner.
Correct, yeah, me and my wife. And I thought that would make the relationship worse. But when I actually had the opportunity to, February this year, to start traveling to Melbourne once a month and spending, a long weekend with him, and it was just one-on-one, just me and him. It's, what are we, like I've probably gone there half a dozen times, brought him to Perth twice for the school holidays. We're definitely closer now than we were before. One, because I'm open to being vulnerable and giving myself to him, and two, because I'm actually focused on him, during the times that we're, spending time together. Where before I'd always be distracted because there's something else going on, like someone's calling me from work, or I'm worrying about something else. Where now it's like I'm actually focused on him during those times, which has actually helped our relationship a lot more.
How were you able to bring about that change and leave your ego to one side, and the fact that you might have been right or you might have been wrong, or she might have done the wrong thing, or, who knows, but there was all that mess and noise. How have you been able to put that aside and just focus on the needs of the child?
It took some serious pain and some lessons to be able to realize that. But one of the things that even my 3-year-old said to me when we were moving houses here in Perth recently, he said to me, are you moving houses with us? Because even me just traveling to Melbourne for 4 to 7 days a month, he felt the impact of that. And that shocked me. Like my 3-year-old son is, not sure whether his dad's going to be around or not. And then I reflected back to me as a kid and everything that what is it I really want? Like, it's to have a loving relationship that I didn't have with my dad. So it's like, what do I need to do to be able to have that? And it's not think of myself, and what is it in the best interest of like my kids, and with my son's mother that I'm co-parenting, even though we don't communicate still. But it's like, well, what can I do? I'm not going to engage in conversations that are not going to help us get into, any form of moving forward. Just be courteous and polite to let her know things, and that, you know, I thought, well, stuff I don't really need to let her know, but just trying to do anything to move forward, because it's like, it's pointless. You know, I've moved on with my life, and you know, she has a new partner now, so, you know, why should we stay in this rut? And hopefully we're able to eventually move on, and for the benefit of our son, because I know it definitely impacts him in ways that, you know, we may not be able to see it at the time.
So is it something that he ever talks about, or is it something that you communicate to him about, or you don't really speak about it when you see him?
I don't mention anything about his mum when we're together, other than, you know, whether it's her calling to speak to him during the times like when he came over for school holidays. But you know, I just completely avoid, you know, just discussing anything in regards to their household, or, you know, what they do, because one, it's, you know, it's not my business, and the main thing for me is, as long as my son's okay, then I'm all good. And you know, there's things of, for instance, earlier on when the piece where I'd buy him something and I'd ask him about, you know, how this thing's going, and he's like, oh, it's in the bin. And it's like, okay. And, you know, I don't ask anything, but I know obviously what's happened, and he'll avoid now wanting to take stuff with him. And that's without me even saying anything. So, you know, kids know what's going on. They're not silly. So they're the things that I, you know, try to do the best I can to minimise the, you know, the issues that he experiences, so that, you know, to not have hopefully too much of an impact on his later days when he grows up.
And then meeting your now wife and having 2 more children, how'd you go about that from a mental standpoint, having just, and still now going through the experience of your first child and his mother, going into then another relationship and more kids? How are you able to sort of orient yourself with all that, and what mentality did you go into that with?
I definitely didn't go into it with a good mentality. Part of it was still having that need to have that relationship, you know, that teddy bear as kids need as a comfort. And I wasn't necessarily being the dad that I still wanted to be, even though my kids, that I lived in the same house, I was still doing the same stuff with work and everything. And it pretty much took for me to move away for me to be able to change my habits. And first was working on myself and being able to really go deep and acknowledge the things and work on the things that I was struggling with. And one of the things was looking after my health. And then from there, I've been able to change my mindset and approach, you know, my marriage, my relationship with all my kids. You know, I work from home now instead of working at an office or, you know, on site or a location like I used to. You know, it took some issues for me to be able to realize that, you know, if I wanted to not be in the same situation again, I had to act and make some change.
You feel like you've changed from when you had your first child to the man that you are now and the dad you are now?
Wow. So much, even in the last 12 months. But from the first time that I became a dad, like, I'm a completely different person. You know, my values, what's important to me, that's all changed, you know, not being in that state of anger and frustration with, you know, even my own childhood and stuff like that. That's all changed, which I think has resulted in me having a better relationship with my own kids and my wife. So yeah, massive shift.
In your view, how do you reckon the family court system is set up against fathers?
I don't think it's definitely not, it doesn't have a view of, you know, looking at both sides as equal. You know, one of the first times I went to court, I was told that if you don't agree to what is suggested and we have to wait for a later hearing date, it might be, you know, might not see your son for 12 to 18 months. And I was like, well, okay, isn't that pretty much like extortion? Like, I'm having agreed to something that I don't necessarily think that it's right. But it's, the view is that, especially when kids are at a certain age, they're more reliant on the birth mother for, certain reasons, like feeding and so forth. It is definitely challenging. I'll never forget the first time I even walked into court, like seeing a dad completely tears, and who knows what, was the result of his case. But yeah, it's definitely a system that I don't think is looked at from an equal perspective of what's in the best interest for the kids as such.
I guess when you're going up against a whole system, it's not like it's probably something you're going to be able to change on your own. So it sounds like you came to a place where you were able to change your perspective and change your outlook and the way that you were approaching this very difficult situation, where you decided to stop butting heads and try your best to be courteous and be agreeable, and not, I suppose I wouldn't say back down and give up by any means, but just to sort of change your approach and think about it in a different way, because it sounds like you were just banging your head on a brick wall and doing the same thing again and again, getting the same result, getting angry, not being healthy, being frustrated, nothing getting better, which I think is how a lot of men dealing with the family court system feel. And then the thing that you were able to change was how you were approaching it and making a decision in your mind to do things differently, and that eventually led to a better result. But it wasn't like you single-handedly changed the court system to then make a different decision. You made a different decision.
Absolutely. And the realization was, I didn't find out my son what school he was going to until the day that he was enrolled. And part of the court orders was that we both had to agree on a school that would be best for our son. And when I went to court and had brought that up, it was pretty much just brushed over. And for me, I was like, well, okay, wait a minute. I'm not actually going to get anywhere if I keep doing the same thing that I'm doing. So it was, like you said, me taking a different approach. Like, okay, I'm still going to be present. I'm still going to show up for my son when I need to. I'll always be there, and I'm not going to ruin the next whatever amount of years until my son's old enough to make his own decisions. Our relationship, my life, his life, and everyone else around us. Because, like, really, none of us are going to change the law, overnight. And I think continuously attacking and fighting one another is definitely not going to be the solution. The court's already backlogged as it is. The last thing we need to do is just add more fuel to the fire.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and one that I'm just thinking, if I was listening to this and I was a single dad and I was in that sort of situation, what would I want to hear? What's something that I can start to do differently because I'm so frustrated? And I think it's just very interesting hearing you put it that way and say that it was about changing the way that you were viewing things and how you were approaching it. And I guess in some ways being the bigger man and maybe having to swallow your pride a bit, because that was the only way forward. And that's a really important piece of advice. Why are you so motivated to help other single dads? Are you not a single dad anymore? Do you still consider yourself one?
No, definitely not. I'm very fortunate to have, a wife in my life and the support that she's given me. She's definitely helped me through, the journey. But I remember the first time that I'd experienced. I was a single dad from day one, but experienced being in that situation of I'm not knowing where I stand, what access I was going to have to my son. And one of the main reason for me changing careers from construction and property for 20 years to this was there was two incidents that happened in Perth over Christmas last year and March this year, where a father first had taken his life, but also the life of his kids. And then later on, a mother did the same. And for me, it was like, no, like, this has got to stop. There's no way that this is a solution. And the more that we keep going down the path that we have been, it's going to end up in more disaster. So for me, it's like if I can help any dad change the way that they deal with things and create, the vision that they want for themselves and also their kids, then that's a win and a lot more fulfilling for me than any other career that I could do.
And how have you been doing that so far? What sort of an impact have you seen that make on some other dads?
It's, initially I just started with, the podcast. And I was starting to get some feedback, some messages, from dads being grateful for being open and vulnerable and sharing my story. And then I started working with a few dads one-on-one and for them to be able to change their mindset and approach the situation differently to what they'd been doing all the time previously, it's resulted in them being a lot more happier, them focusing on what's in the best interest for their kids, not the battle between them and their ex-partner. And yeah, it's a much more enjoyable situation than it was before.
What's this done for your own healing, I suppose, around this situation that you went through, which is ongoing to the extent that your son's going to have a life and be part of your life forever? Impact, though, does your work now have on your own healing from that situation of the pain that you went through and also the way that you've come to understand it all and everything that's happened?
This whole process from initially working myself, but then also now working with dads, it's helped me as well. Dealing with having a lot more insights even on my own experiences, whether it's a child or as a adult co-parenting. It's definitely helped me through my own process, and I'm a lot more confident, a lot more vulnerable. I own more of who I am, where before it'd be like I wasn't comfortable in being able to speak up. And I think having, the confidence to be able to share my story has definitely helped me heal. But I think if a lot more other dads were open to even speaking with someone, that would help them through their experience. And just getting it off your chest and not having to think that you need to put the whole weight of the world on your own shoulders and deal with everything yourself.
Yeah, it's a really important message to put out there, and it's great to create something as a service for men to be able to access, because anecdotally it sounds like there's so many men who really struggle with the family court system, really have a tough time co-parenting, seem like they get a raw deal a lot of the time, and there's not really anywhere to turn to other than your typical psychologist, psychiatrist, counsellor, which is all important. But having other men that we can turn to and be coached through it, and someone who really gets it from that level of experience, I think that's super important, not something that's really existed before. So take my hat off to you for using that pain that you went through and turning it into something that's so productive, because it's obviously super needed. Where can people find more of you, Pat?
Yeah, they can contact us through our website, resilientdad.com, or through our social media pages, our Facebook group, Resilient Dad. Yeah, that's the best way to contact us.
Sweet. Well, thanks for telling us your story and for being such a good dad by the sounds of things.
Appreciate it. Thanks very much for having us on.
Cheers, man.
That's it for this episode. Thanks to our local business supporters, Herd Financial and First National Real Estate. Making these podcasts isn't cheap, and we can't do it alone. If you'd like to become a supporter, please send an email to callum@youngbloodmedia.com.au. If you're getting some value out of the show, please give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It really helps us out. You can watch every episode in studio quality video on Spotify and our YouTube channel, Youngblood Men's Mental Health. We go by the same name on Instagram and Facebook, and follow Youngblood Mental Health on TikTok. Subscribe to our e-news through our website, youngbloodmedia.com.au, and most importantly, share this podcast with someone who needs to hear it. We're all in this together. Catch you next time.